Every trucker has a story, but some stories are better left untold. Jake Collins had been driving trucks for over a decade. He was the kind of guy who loved the open road, the solitude, and the quiet nights. But one night, deep in the mountains of West Virginia, Jake encountered something that would haunt him forever. It was a cold winter's night, and the snow was falling heavily. Jake was driving down a deserted stretch of highway when he saw her, a young woman, standing by the side of the road, her arms wrapped around herself as if she was freezing. Jake slowed down, the beam of his headlights illuminating her pale face and wide, desperate eyes. He hesitated. Picking up hitchhikers wasn't something he usually did, but there was something about this woman that made him stop. He couldn't just leave her out in the cold. Besides, he told himself, she looked harmless enough. Need a ride? He asked as he rolled down the window. The woman nodded, her expression one of relief. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. Jake unlocked the passenger door and she climbed in, shivering. As he started driving again, Jake tried to make small talk, but the woman was quiet, only offering brief, vague responses. She didn't say where she was going, only that she needed to get away. Her clothes were soaked through and her hair was wet, as if she had been out in the snow for hours. Something about her unsettled Jake, but he couldn't put his finger on it. She seemed distant, almost as if she wasn't really there. But the road was long, and Jake had a job to do. He focused on the highway ahead, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine. As they drove, Jake couldn't help but glance at the woman from time to time. There was something off about her, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Her skin was unnaturally pale, and her clothes looked old-fashioned, as if she was from another era. Jake's unease grew when he realized she wasn't leaving any footprints in the snow when they had stopped earlier. The thought gnawed at him, but he dismissed it as a trick of the light or his tired mind playing games. After all, he'd been on the road for hours. The woman's silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Every now and then she would mutter something under her breath, but Jake couldn't make out the words. Her eyes, though, told a different story. They were filled with a deep sadness, a sorrow that seemed to consume her entire being. "Are you okay?" Jake finally asked, unable to stand the tension any longer. The woman turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I've been lost for so long," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just need to get home." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. The way she said it, like she wasn't talking about a physical place but something else entirely, made his skin crawl. "Where's home?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she looked out the window, her eyes fixed on something far in the distance, something only she could see. The snow continued to fall, the road ahead obscured by a thick white blanket. Jake's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He didn't know what to make of the situation, but something told him he was in over his head. As the hours passed, the tension in the truck grew unbearable. Jake's unease had turned into full-blown fear. The woman hadn't spoken again, and the silence was maddening. Every so often, Jake would hear faint whispers, but when he looked at the woman, her lips weren't moving. It was as if the truck itself was haunted. Finally, Jake couldn't take it anymore. He needed to know what was going on. He pulled over to the side of the road, the tires crunching in the snow, and turned to the woman. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling despite his efforts to stay calm. The woman looked at him with those sad, haunted eyes, and for a moment, Jake thought she might actually answer him, but instead, she simply smiled. A sad, knowing smile, and then she was gone, just like that. One moment she was there, and the next, she had vanished into thin air. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he frantically searched the cab, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no trace of her, no sign that she had ever been there at all, except for one thing. The passenger seat was wet, as if someone had been sitting there, dripping with water. Jake's mind reeled. He had heard stories of phantom hitchhikers before, but he had never believed them. Ghost stories were just that, stories. But now, faced with the impossible, he couldn't deny what he had seen, or rather, what he hadn't seen. Shaken, Jake continued his journey, but the experience left him deeply unsettled. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman, her sad eyes, and her mysterious disappearance. When he finally reached a truck stop hours later, he was exhausted, both physically and mentally. He parked his rig and made his way to the diner, hoping a hot cup of coffee might help clear his mind. As he sat at the counter, he struck up a conversation with an older trucker sitting next to him. The man had the look of someone who had seen it all, and Jake figured if anyone might have an explanation, it would be him. "You ever heard of a phantom hitchhiker around these parts?" Jake asked, trying to sound casual. The older man's expression turned serious, and he nodded slowly. "You're talking about the girl, aren't you? The one who haunts Route 19. Jake's blood ran cold. "You know about her?" The man sighed, taking a long sip of his coffee before answering. "Yeah, I know about her. It's an old story around here. They say she was a young woman who got caught in a blizzard on this very highway years ago. She was trying to get home, but she never made it. Froze to death out there in the snow." Jake felt a knot form in his stomach. "So her spirit's been wandering that stretch of road ever since," the older trucker continued. "Some say she's looking for a ride home. Others think she's trying to warn drivers about the dangers of the road. But once she gets in your truck, she always disappears before you reach your destination." Jake sat in stunned silence. It all made sense now. The strange clothes, the old-fashioned appearance, the way she had vanished without a trace. After hearing the old trucker's story, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the woman had been trying to tell him something. He replayed their conversation in his head, trying to decipher the meaning behind her cryptic words. "I just need to get home." Was she warning him about something? Or was she simply lost, searching for a way to rest? Jake decided he needed to know more. He spent the next few days researching the legend of the phantom hitchhiker. He combed through old newspaper archives and talked to locals who claimed to have encountered the ghostly woman. The more he learned, the more obsessed he became. He discovered that the woman had been named Emily Parker, a young bride who had been traveling to her new home when the blizzard struck. She had never made it, and her body had been found days later, frozen in the snow. The tragedy had shocked the small town, and her story had been passed down through generations. But there was more. According to some accounts, Emily's spirit had been seen at the site of a deadly accident that had occurred years after her death. A trucker had lost control of his rig in a snowstorm and had crashed into a ravine. The locals believed Emily had appeared to warn him, but he hadn't heeded her warning. Jake couldn't help but wonder if that was what she had been trying to do for him. Warn him about something, but warn him about what? He had been careful on the road, especially after his encounter with her. Had he missed something? The thought gnawed at him, and Jake knew there was only one way to find out. He needed to go back to where it all began. Determined to uncover the truth, Jake decided to retrace his route from that fateful night. He knew it was risky, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to confront whatever it was that Emily had been trying to warn him about. As he drove down the same stretch of highway, the snow began to fall again, just like it had that night. The landscape was eerily familiar, and Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of dread as he approached the spot where he had picked up Emily. He slowed down, scanning the roadside for any sign of her, but there was nothing, just the empty road and the snow-covered trees. Jake kept driving, his eyes glued to the road ahead. Then, in the distance, he saw it, a figure standing by the side of the road, just like before. Jake Thompson had been on the road for more than 20 years, and nothing seemed capable of shaking his routine. The job was simple: pick up the cargo, deliver it on time, and keep moving. But one night, as he began his shift on a long-haul route through the desert, things took a sinister turn. It was a clear night, the stars bright against the deep black sky. Jake was driving a fully loaded rig, the hum of the engine a steady, reassuring sound. He had been on this route hundreds of times, and it was supposed to be a smooth, uneventful journey. As he approached an isolated stretch of highway known for its desolation, he noticed a strange car parked on the side of the road. It was an old sedan, its headlights off, and the car itself seemed out of place in the middle of nowhere. Jake's instincts told him to keep moving, but his sense of duty got the better of him. He pulled over, thinking someone might be in trouble. He rolled down his window, calling out into the night, "Hey, you need any help?" There was no response. Jake got out of the truck, the cold desert air hitting him like a wall. He approached the sedan cautiously, peering through the windshield. The interior was empty, but the car's engine was still warm. It was as if someone had just left it moments ago. Jake's curiosity got the best of him. He walked around the car, noticing a strange odor, something foul and putrid. He shrugged it off, thinking it was just a dead animal nearby. He was about to head back to his truck when he heard a noise, a low guttural growl coming from the darkness. Jake froze, his heart racing. He quickly jumped back into his rig, locked the doors, and started the engine. He didn't want to stick around any longer. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He arrived at the delivery point, a remote warehouse, just before dawn. The area was quiet, and the few workers present seemed to go about their tasks with an air of distraction. Jake unloaded his cargo, but the encounter with the strange car was weighing heavily on his mind. As he finished up, he decided to check his route for any news about recent accidents or reports. He turned on his radio and tuned into the local news. To his shock, he heard a report about a missing person, a young woman who had been driving a sedan similar to the one he had seen. The details matched exactly, down to the make and model of the car. The woman had been reported missing just hours before Jake's encounter. Jake's heart sank. The news anchor mentioned something about a search party being organized and urged anyone with information to come forward. Jake felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He knew he had seen that car, and he had a sinking feeling that something terrible had happened. The following night, Jake's shift was filled with dread. He drove the same route, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain what he had seen. The desert was as desolate as ever, the silence only broken by the sound of his truck's tires on the road. As he approached the spot where he had seen the car, he noticed something strange. A lone, flickering light in the distance. It looked like a lantern or some kind of light source. Jake stopped his truck and got out, the memory of the previous night's encounter fresh in his mind. He walked towards the light, feeling an increasing sense of dread with each step. The light led him to an old, abandoned gas station. The place looked like it hadn't been used in years, but the light was definitely coming from inside. Jake cautiously approached, peeking through the cracked windows. Inside, he saw a figure hunched over what looked like a makeshift altar. The figure was cloaked in shadow, but Jake could make out the glint of something metallic in its hands. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his curiosity got the better of him. He decided to investigate further. He entered the gas station, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The figure seemed to be performing some sort of ritual, muttering incoherently. As Jake drew closer, he realized with horror that the ritual involved items from the missing woman's car. Personal belongings, photos, and even pieces of clothing. The figure suddenly turned towards him, and Jake's blood ran cold. The face he saw was not human. It was a grotesque mask of horror, eyes wide with madness. Jake bolted out of the gas station, his heart pounding. He made it back to his truck and drove away. The image of the figure burned into his mind. Jake's mind was reeling as he continued his drive. He couldn't believe what he had just seen. It wasn't just an isolated incident, it was something much more sinister. A few days later, while taking a break at a truck stop, Jake overheard a conversation between a couple of local truckers. They were talking about the recent discovery of a series of gruesome murders connected to the same area Jake had been driving through. The missing woman was one of the victims. Jake's blood ran cold as he realized that the figure he had seen was likely connected to these murders. The ritualistic nature of what he had witnessed indicated that something far more horrific was happening in the desert. He tried to piece together everything he knew: the strange car, the eerie growl, the ritualistic figure, and it became clear that he had stumbled into something far beyond his understanding. The desert was hiding dark secrets, and Jake had inadvertently walked into the middle of it. Determined to bring some closure to the case, Jake contacted the local authorities, sharing everything he had seen and experienced. They took his report seriously and began investigating the abandoned gas station and the ritualistic practices he had described. The police found disturbing evidence at the gas station, including more personal belongings from the missing woman, and traces of a sinister cult that had been operating in the area for years. They launched a full-scale investigation, and Jake's information helped them close in on the perpetrators. But Jake's involvement didn't end there. The discovery brought media attention, and Jake found himself facing the haunting memories of his encounter. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if the darkness from the desert had followed him. One night, as he was driving a new route, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the distance, he saw a figure standing by the side of the road, an old sedan parked nearby. He knew it was a trap, a final act of the twisted cult trying to lure him back. Jake sped past, not daring to stop. He never spoke of that night again, but the memories lingered, a constant reminder of the darkness that can lie hidden in the most unexpected places. Jake Thompson's life slowly returned to normal, but the desert's echoes remained with him. He continued driving trucks, but every time he passed through that stretch of highway, he was haunted by the memories of that night. The abandoned gas station was eventually discovered and demolished, but the legend of the desert's dark secrets lived on. Jake knew that he had narrowly escaped becoming a part of that legend, a reminder of the evil that lurks in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. For Tom Sanders, working the night shift at a remote toll booth was a routine job. The toll booth was situated on a lonely stretch of highway, far from the nearest town. Most nights were uneventful, with only the occasional truck or car passing through. It was a particularly quiet night when Tom noticed something unusual. A car had pulled up to the toll booth, but it wasn't just any car. It was an old, battered sedan, its headlights flickering erratically. The driver, a man in a long coat, was wearing a hat that obscured his face. Tom's unease grew as the man handed over the exact change for the toll without saying a word. His eyes were hidden beneath the brim of his hat, and there was something unsettling about the way he stared ahead, as if he wasn't really seeing anything. "Have a good night," Tom said, trying to sound cheerful. The man merely nodded and drove off into the darkness. Tom watched as the car's taillights disappeared into the distance, feeling a shiver run down his spine. The following night, Tom was working the same shift when the old sedan appeared again. This time, the driver was even more mysterious. His face was completely hidden, and he didn't even bother to hand over any money. Instead, he just stared at Tom through the window. Tom was beginning to feel a growing sense of dread. The car showed up every night at the same time, and the driver's eerie presence was starting to affect his nerves. He tried to dismiss it as just a coincidence, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the days went by, Tom noticed other strange occurrences. The toll booth's lights flickered intermittently, and he often heard strange noises coming from the darkness outside. It was as if the night itself was alive with hidden threats. One night, Tom decided to follow the old sedan after it left the toll booth. He was determined to uncover the mystery behind the driver's strange behavior. He got into his own car and trailed behind, keeping a safe distance. The sedan took him down a series of winding back roads until it reached an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. Tom parked his car and watched as the sedan disappeared inside the factory gates. He approached the factory cautiously, his heart pounding. As he crept closer, he saw the sedan parked near the entrance. The factory was dark and foreboding, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. Tom hesitated at the entrance, but his curiosity got the better of him. He entered the factory, moving carefully through the dark, dusty interior. The silence was eerie, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. As he reached the main hall, he saw the driver standing in the middle of a strange ritual circle drawn on the floor. Around him were various eerie symbols and occult objects. Tom's blood ran cold as he realized that the driver was part of a cult, performing a sinister ritual. The cult members were chanting in a language Tom couldn't understand, their voices echoing through the factory. The driver, still obscured by his hat, was at the center of the ritual, holding a ceremonial dagger. Tom's heart raced as he watched, hidden in the shadows. The ritual seemed to be focused on summoning something from the darkness, an entity that seemed to be taking shape in the center of the circle. The air grew colder, and Tom felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He knew he had to get out before it was too late. He turned to leave, but as he did, he accidentally knocked over a stack of old crates. The noise alerted the cult members, and they began to search the factory for any intruders. Tom ran as fast as he could, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He barely made it out of the factory and back to his car. He sped away, his mind racing with the horrors he had just witnessed. The next day, Tom reported what he had seen to the authorities. The factory was investigated, and while no evidence of the cult was found, Tom's account was taken seriously. The police increased patrols in the area, but the factory was eventually abandoned once again. Tom's shifts at the toll booth were never the same. He continued to work there, but he could never shake the feeling of being watched. The old sedan never returned, but the memory of that night haunted him. He eventually left the job and moved to a new town, hoping to escape the shadow of the toll booth terror. But the nightmares continued, and the fear of what he had witnessed stayed with him. The toll booth remained a dark chapter in his life, a reminder of the evil that can lurk in the most unexpected places. Years later, Tom heard rumors about the toll booth being demolished. The site was to be repurposed for a new development. He hoped that closing that chapter of his life would finally bring him peace. But even as he tried to move on, he occasionally heard unsettling stories from other workers about strange occurrences at the new development site. Tom knew that the darkness from the old toll booth had left its mark, and he could only hope that it had been buried along with the factory's ruins. The memories of the toll booth, The old sedan and the cult's ritual would always remain with him, a haunting reminder of the hidden evils that can dwell in the most mundane places. Ethan Parker was a seasoned trucker who prided himself on handling the toughest routes with ease. Tonight, he was tasked with a long haul through the mountainous terrain of the Pacific Northwest, a route he had driven countless times. The winding roads and thick forests were familiar, but tonight there was a peculiar chill in the air. As Ethan began his shift, the sun set behind the mountains, plunging the landscape into darkness. The road was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustling of leaves and the hum of his truck's engine breaking the silence. He put on his favorite classic rock station and settled into the rhythm of the drive. Hours passed, and the familiar roads seemed to stretch on endlessly. Just as he was about to take a quick break at a rest area, he noticed something unusual. A car was parked by the side of the road, its engine running and headlights glaring into the night. Ethan slowed down, pulling up beside the car. It was an old, dusty vehicle, and the driver was nowhere to be seen. The rest area was empty, and the stillness of the night felt oppressive. Ethan frowned, wondering if someone needed help. He decided to get out and check, his boots crunching on the gravel. As he approached the car, he noticed the driver's seat was empty, but the car's interior was oddly pristine, almost too clean. The keys were in the ignition, and the radio was playing softly. Ethan glanced around, but there was no sign of anyone. Feeling uneasy, Ethan got back into his truck and continued on his route, hoping it was just a random incident. But as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. As the night wore on, Ethan began to notice strange occurrences. The temperature dropped suddenly, and he could see his breath fogging up the windshield. The radio static increased, and eerie whispers seemed to seep through the speakers. He tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the fatigue of the long drive. The road twisted through dense forests, and the darkness was nearly complete. Every now and then, he saw shadowy figures darting through the trees, but when he looked closer, they vanished. Ethan's heart raced, and he started to feel like he was losing his grip on reality. At one point, he noticed a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a man dressed in worn-out clothes, his face obscured by a hood. The man didn't move as Ethan drove past, but Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. Determined to shake off the growing anxiety, Ethan pulled into another rest area, hoping to find some solace. But as he stepped out of his truck, he heard faint, haunting laughter coming from the woods. He quickly got back inside, locking the doors and starting the engine. After a few more hours of driving, Ethan saw a hitchhiker on the side of the road. The figure was a young woman, her face pale and gaunt. She wore a tattered dress and held a sign that read, "Help me." Ethan hesitated, but something about her appearance tugged at his conscience. He pulled over and rolled down his window. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need a ride?" The woman's eyes met his, and he was struck by the emptiness in her gaze. She didn't respond verbally, but nodded slowly, as if too exhausted to speak. Ethan opened the door and she climbed into the passenger seat. As they drove, Ethan tried to make conversation, but the woman remained silent. Her presence was unsettling, and the air in the truck grew colder. Ethan occasionally glanced at her, noticing that she seemed to be staring out of the window, lost in her own world. After a while, Ethan noticed that the woman's appearance seemed to be changing. Her clothes became more tattered, and her skin grew more translucent. He felt a wave of panic and decided to stop at the next rest area. When he parked and turned to check on her, she was gone. The seat was empty, and the door was slightly ajar. Ethan's heart pounded as he searched the area, but there was no sign of the woman. The rest area was deserted, and the cold wind whispered through the trees. Ethan resumed his journey, his nerves frayed. As he drove through the dark, winding roads, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The whispers on the radio grew louder, and the shadows in the trees seemed to move with malicious intent. Suddenly he saw a vision that made his blood run cold. In the middle of the road, illuminated by his headlights, was a scene from a nightmare. There were several figures lying on the ground, their bodies contorted in unnatural positions. Their faces were twisted in expressions of terror and pain. Ethan slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. He got out of the truck, but when he approached the figures, they vanished into thin air. The road was empty, and there was no sign of any disturbance. Shaken, Ethan climbed back into his truck and continued driving. The vision replayed in his mind, and he couldn't understand what he had seen. Was it a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, or was there something more sinister at play? As dawn approached, Ethan saw a faint glow on the horizon. He was relieved to be nearing the end of his route. But his relief was short-lived. The radio crackled to life, and a distorted voice came through, barely intelligible but clearly desperate. "Help. Trapped. On the road. Don't let them." The voice was filled with anguish, and Ethan couldn't make out the rest of the message. He tried to contact the dispatcher, but the radio signal was too weak. He felt a growing sense of urgency and dread. He reached for his phone to call for help, but the battery was dead. He was stranded, alone on the desolate road with no way to communicate with the outside world. Panic set in as he realized he was completely isolated. The sun began to rise, casting eerie shadows across the road. Ethan drove faster, hoping to reach his destination and escape the nightmare. But the sense of being watched never left him, and every shadow seemed to conceal a lurking danger. Finally, Ethan arrived at his destination, a small truck depot on the edge of a sleepy town. As he parked and began unloading, he couldn't shake the feeling of relief mixed with lingering dread. The sight of other people bustling around the depot offered a sense of normalcy that was desperately needed. While speaking with the depot manager, Ethan learned that the area had been plagued by mysterious disappearances over the past few weeks. Truckers and travelers had reported strange encounters and ghostly figures on the road. The stories matched the terrifying experiences Ethan had just endured. The manager revealed that the old road Ethan had traveled was infamous for its hauntings and was rumored to be cursed. The area had a history of tragic accidents and unexplained phenomena, leaving it shrouded in mystery and fear. Ethan's encounter with the hitchhiker, the haunting visions, and the distorted radio message suddenly made sense. He had been driving through a place steeped in darkness and terror. As he left the depot and prepared to return home, Ethan knew he would never forget the horrors of that night. The road had left its mark on him, and the memory of the eerie figures, the ghostly whispers, and the chilling visions would haunt him for years to come. The lonesome road had proven to be far more than just a highway. It was a gateway to nightmares that defied explanation.